I think that's a good point, and we have a lot of topics that would be nice to cover like philosophy kind of questions that know you love, and psychedelics perhaps, and whatnot. But just to close the point perhaps about analytics, AI, how companies can get started. If you were to recommend a company, let me just take an example. You can choose another example if you prefer, but let's say some retailer or a company that now becomes increasingly scared when Amazon is launching in Sweden soon, and feel like, okay, we really need to step up here to be able to have a chance against Amazon and use data and AI properly. How would you recommend them? Let's say that they don't have that much digitalization. They have some, of course, some web analytics and whatnot, but how would you recommend them to proceed? It's a general question, I know. And feel free to change it if you want. But
yeah, it's an interesting and difficult question. And there's a reason why there's a whole slew of consultants out there pushing and consulting services to help you with this. How do you tackle Amazon? It's a very interesting question because once we go digital, we basically level the playing field and we create a single market. I know the European Union has this single digital data market. Yeah.
Should be called digitized market, but it's called digital market.
and really, digitalization and the digital infrastructure backbone creates this single global market. And on that market, there's an upside to data richness. And once you sort of establish a certain amount of sort of hegemony in terms of data ownership, or once you have a powerful enough position in terms of your data, you become very difficult to face, simply because you can just out data drive the competition. So if you are a smaller actor on that same single global digital market, you really need to find ways of not brute forcing your attack on Amazon or on the competition. You really need to sort of think about it differently in terms of what is the value add that you can bring forth that Amazon can't. And it may have to do with brand perception. Perhaps retail or consumers are not pro Amazon because Amazon has a poor working policy ethics. So maybe you would prefer. Maybe you could buy the thing from Amazon or the thing from the other place, and that but they don't give their employees minimum wage in a way that they can sustain their business. I'm going to go here, so you could play that angle. But you need to find a way of getting on the digital landscape. You cannot not be there for sure, but you just need to think differently about things. I don't really have a good prescriptive approach to this. I'm very concerned about the data tech giants. What do they call them? The big six or the big
GAFA companies?
Maybe the GAFA company. Yeah. So that's a great concern for me. And I read a very interesting piece on, because of technology's impact on the world and how and the speed it has impacted the world, regulatory mechanisms haven't been able to mitigate or deal with this fact, right? So there's been old hat thinking coming up against the digital onslaught of people going online. So therefore, if you look at how did Google or Amazon, if you will, rise to power? How did that happen? Well, a lot of it happened through acquisitions and mergers and acquisitions, and they just merge, and eventually they were super big. And when they were super big, super data rich, getting more data rich all the time, now we have a problem that is evident to everybody. But it was evident to other people early on, but they weren't able to articulate it in a way that made it possible for regulators to say, well, what about antitrust? What about competition? What about that unique position? How do we deal with that? So now I think we're in this very challenging times where we've ended up in a situation that wasn't clear to a lot of people. But it was clear to Jeff Bezos. It was clear to Zuckerberg. It was clear to some really clever people that got on the digital data train early. And they've just been chewing at full throttle out of station for a long time. And it's very difficult to catch up.
So would you say, are you optimistic or pessimistic to how to compete with Amazon, for example? Do you think like a small Swedish retailer have a chance to actually compete with them?
I would like to think so. I'm concerned. I think there is a risk of poorness of choice, if you will. I think the selection or the alternatives. Like, there's a reason why we have antitrust laws. I mean, we like to see a healthy competition on a level playing field, and it's difficult to tell. What was it, Microsoft who ended up in this case some years ago? They wanted they were growing too big in some area.
Explorer problem, perhaps.
Yeah, the Explorer Netscape thing.
Operating system.
Operating systems, perhaps.
Or Explorer, or the Explorer maybe.
Yeah,
could they embed the Explorer, the web
right,
browser?
Could they offer that for free as a part of the operating system? Yeah. And they couldn't, or they could, I forget. But anyway, these types of problems are acute and they need to be dealt with. So although I think of myself as an anarchist at heart, I sort of want to sort of pull the lifeline of regulatory governance onto the market and say, hey, this doesn't work simply because it's not beneficial to the many. It's beneficial to the few. Yeah, and I think we see that being played out in, the personal wealth of
and the tricky part, as we also highlighted, I think, in the last interview, is that the current regulatory field actually plays in the hands of the GAFA companies, because they now have the fundamental legal power, technology know-how to understand and manage and be compliant with the current regulations, which is for a less mature company really difficult, because they don't really understand how to deal with it. So it's actually right now not the intended purpose is good, but who's really hurting in terms of acceleration or slowing down, it's actually really serious.
The opposite effect, yeah.
It's the opposite effect.
Yeah, it is. And I'm thinking of, to return to the question of intelligence, I think, and education, I think this is where the need for both come into play. We need to have conscious consumers. We need to educate people about the fact that their choice matters. It matters if you vote or you don't vote. It matters who you vote on. Your actions have implications. The energy consumption of the data storage centers have an impact if you are online all the time. And I think when people that like market economy, they always say, but the market will self-regulate and da-da-da. And sort of theoretically, I guess that is sort of true. But it's not true when you have intelligent people and stupid people. You need to have intelligent people across the board, and people need to be invited to become intelligent or digital savvy. And I don't really think that we see those initiatives enough. And I think we certainly should. I think Ralph Nader, if you recall him, he was really good at raising or creating this conversation around civic and corporate society, and the dangers of giving corporations fact that you can have a distinction between people who actually have power to decide and the responsibility that they should shoulder based on that power. So you have, on the one hand, you have Mark Zuckerberg, who can actually himself just decide things, that relates to Facebook, because he has that power within that organization. And that's one guy, and it will impact a whole lot of people in a whole lot of ways. And you have to ask yourself, is this what we want? Maybe it is, but if it's not, we need to work to change that.
But it comes back to the whole do we regulate the technology, or do we regulate the usage of it? This is your pet philosophy.
Yeah,
I think this is really
regulation
true.
Is a super boring topic, but super important.
Yeah,
and I think a common misconception is that you should regulate technology itself rather than the use, the effect of it, and that's a very dangerous thing to do.
And you always like to bring the example, what we do with data in the public sector or with health data compared to what we do in data in terms of selecting the right music. It has different consequences, how bad, how dangerous it is, sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we need to work sort of the end game, or we need to work change over time or over generations. So it's very difficult to effectuate horizontal change brutally or forcefully. So if you come down and say, now all of a sudden we realized that we need to chop up Google and create 10 separate companies, and they can have the same owner structure. That's very difficult to sort of make happen. But if you say, well, if you educate people over time in the sense that, they need to become digitally savvy, you will have impact over time. But if you have a lot of stupidity out there, that won't happen. So think of, the Black Friday videos you see where people are just storming, Walmart and fighting, and they want the cheap microwave. I mean, that mentality is not a very sustainable mentality for the great future that we could actually stand up if we so wanted to. Because that's just an unfortunate consequence of the educational and economic system that has been in place for a long time. That gives that. And then to say, well, you cannot discount stuff that much because people become crazy, that won't work. So I think you need to sort of attack the problem over time and think, well, the old guys won't be around for so long, but the younger generation is coming up strong, is coming up fast, and tech adoption and tech usage is going down the ages. And the younger people are the future, so you need to sort of get at them, and you do that through enthusiastically triggering them.
But now we can circle all the way back that if we want to educate people, and we see competence is one of the major issues here in terms of the regulators not understanding and knowing this. I think the whole industry hype story is the problem that, yes, the industry is talking about these new technologies, but they're talking to the IT department, and the business department don't know, and then the IT department don't know the business. So we are back to this number one pedagogical goal, to create the internal engine of people, regulators, business leaders to learn, to really dip their hands in here.
Yes, and I think, just look at the impact of Greta on the environment.
The Greta effect.
The Greta effect, right? But so think about that. Up until Greta came along, most people were like, awesome, I can fly to Dublin for $1. Phenomenal, I'm going to go do that. And it's like, how could it be so cheap? But what do you think? How can it be cheaper to, import organic honey from Argentina compared to like having locally sourced bee honey, and all these economic systems? They say something about how we are being, how we sort of act out, or how we sort of behave. Mm-hmm. So, and you can if you inform people about their consequences, you can change them. And Greta came along and said, hey, this whole flying thing, it creates a problem for us. And then all of a sudden people got into this flygskam thing. And like, I used to sort of, blog all the time about, I'm flying there, the frequent mileage. And all of a sudden it became like, don't do that, man. That's just
I think this is a great example, because we were a bit negative, I think, speaking about how should we have a chance against Amazon. Let's just go back and die.
Yeah, I was thinking about that.
Regulation
we need to have fun, we
need
need to have enthusiasm. It also needs to reflect on the vlog, yeah?
Yeah, I just like to try to bring some more optimism into this discussion. And I think the Greta is a perfect example of that the small one can actually move giants. And I remember some talk or some quote from Google, and they asked, aren't you afraid about Apple and Amazon, and how are you going to compete with the big giants? And he said, no, you're not really afraid of them. We are really afraid about the small startup that has done something we haven't thought about. And that is really what the main challenge is. And I would say it is certainly possible, even for a small Swedish retailer that is perhaps feeling a bit scared right now, if they actually do have a first principle thinking, starting to digitize properly, to very much have a big chance against Amazon.
I think it's a huge opportunity, and it's the whole flipping this whole into passion, and like, it's a little bit like, are you gonna go home and die because it's a new competitor coming to the market, or you basically say, shit, I need to beat these guys at their own game, take that as a challenge, go home, find your first principle, figure out exactly what this is all about, finding your niche, whatever it is, how you need to do it differently, but don't lay over and die. I mean, like the whole COVID situation, I think it's in a lot of ways a very crazy situation and a lot of frustration and hardship at work, but at the same time a lot of positivity in terms of let's just get this done. Let's just figure something new out. And I think that's where this needs to go, that don't be scared. Put your mind into learning. Put your mind into figuring this out. What is your first principle?
Absolutely. And you're certainly right. I mean, the great thing with the digital world we're creating is that if we can just get more and more people into it, we will have more and more brains connected. And those brains will come up with really fun things that we don't ourselves think about. So there's, you know how people say, oh, but diversity is so important for innovation. And you need to have diverse teams. And you need to have different angles. You need to think outside the box and all of this thing.
Adaptability and efficiency.
But that is true. And the great promise of the digital world is that you can move people globally. You know, you can actually have an impact on everybody. Everybody's online. If you're successful on TikTok, boom, you know, you're done. You can impact everybody. Everybody does your dance all of a sudden. You're like, yeah, man, that's what I did. I created the need for doing that. And you can have things go viral. And that is true of the unforeseen or the unthought of also. So whereas we old guys sit here and say, oh, what are we going to do with this thing? There's some kid someplace, you know, he has already figured this out. He's just not, you know, hasn't the entrepreneurial program yet because he's 12 years old. But, you know, give him a couple of years, get him into the incubator, and boom, you know, Amazon is out.
Or even if Amazon is not out, you will learn how to coexist. You will learn how to flip what you thought was the biggest threat into, okay, how do I play in this market now? Because all of a sudden, the main topic is that, hey man, this is not a Swedish market. I guess you have woken up today that this is a global market. So how you define your market, how you define your distribution, everything, we have had a constraint based on the analog view of transportation, of logistics, of our market, which is gone. And I think, so if you take that, oh my God, it's gone. I could sell to anyone. Okay, but how do I do that? And how do I think that? And how can I piggyback on Amazon in some ways to be my niche on some other way? I don't know. I mean, like,
absolutely. And what is interesting with the digital landscape is that it can be a level playing field.
Yes.
It's not necessarily a level playing field, but it can be. But to return to my stint at ATG, the betting company, what was interesting with that company or that situation was that being a, if not state-owned, then state regulated betting company, they had a huge taxation obligation. So in order for them to be allowed to conduct betting, they had to sort of feed the state with, I think it was like for some products maybe 30% of the turnover of that product needed to go into the state. And of course, if you think of the casinos in Las Vegas, right, they have a payout of 98.5% or something. They give back, or keep the service provider keeps 1.5%. So if you on the one hand have regulatory or regulated actors that are bound with their hands behind their back in terms of what they need to pay back, they can't have the same lucrative payout to the players. So therefore, somebody comes along and says, hey, you know, if you play with our casinos instead of that casino, you will get much more back. So I will go there. And then it's not a level playing field because the rules of the game is different. And we can sort of use that analog, that comparison when it comes to globalization and the production of manufactured goods. And you think about the traditional way of doing it, where you say, I want to produce something where it's cheap to produce, and I want to sell it where it's expensive to buy. And then I just move that thing around. But if you do level the playing field, it will be the same cost structure all over because the minimum wage will be the same. The job security will be the same for everybody. So if you could force through regulation, like a minimum wage payout from Amazon, their opportunity for getting at that margin will be less because they have to behave more similar to others if you want to. But if you don't want to, you don't have to go there. But that's one way of looking at what the digital landscape can offer in terms of thinking differently about globalization and the global market.